KIRO, Seattle.
This is COVID-19 Seattle. I'm Dave Ross.
And I'm Aaron Granillo.
After a prison protest over COVID-19 concerns, the state corrections department speaks out.
They broke the quarantine, so really disappointing situation.
What's being done to protect inmates and officers?
More than 24 people living in King County shelters test positive for the virus. Response teams say more cases are likely among our homeless population.
Governor Inslee faces mounting pressure to reopen private construction.
If you say that KIRO can continue, but my builder building a house for a family can't, there's something wrong there.
The complaints come as thousands more construction workers file for unemployment.
Stay with us. The latest on that prison protest at the Monroe Correctional Complex. KIRO Radio's Hannah Scott joins us now. And Hannah, we just got an update from the governor and also the corrections departments. First, remind us, what happened last night there?
Well, there's been kind of some growing tensions. On Sunday, we got word from the state corrections department that there was the first case of a coronavirus inmate testing positive for coronavirus in the minimum security part of the Monroe Correctional Complex, and there were tensions because the next day there was a couple of more, and we started to hear from some family members and loved ones of people who are, and the inmates themselves, who had concerns about there's not enough social distancing space. So last night about 6 o'clock, they decided they were going to have a protest, and we're talking about more than 100 inmates. It was quite a lot of them, and they were protesting, trying to make their point, and the state patrol and then local police were called. In the end, they had, pepper spray was used, something called a sting ball, which is rubber bullets and lights and sound that kind of try to shock the crowd down. In the end, there was dozens with zip ties behind their back and handcuffed, sitting out in the recreational area, the recreational yard. Nobody was hurt or anything like that, but we heard from family members outside who came when the protest started, and they said their wives had said that their husbands were afraid because there was no social distancing there, and that they sit in the chow hall right next to one another, and there's not enough disinfecting going on. So really just, fears coming to kind of boiling up to the point where they tried to make their point.
What did the corrections department say in response?
Secretary Sinclair of the Corrections Department said at this press conference today, look, we've been very diligent about the coronavirus since 5 weeks ago, since we first knew that it was even in the state, when they started to do their cleaning, figure out how they could move maybe people who were considered higher risk, inmates that were higher risk, had different protocols for the staff. And then, of course, obviously, when they found out that they had a positive case here just this last Sunday, they took that person and they immediately isolated them. And then they did contact tracing and found the other inmates that person had been around and quarantined them. He mentioned that some people had broke quarantine. I believe he was referencing last night for the protest. And so that started a whole nother thing, and they've had to move people around again. One of the problems, though, is that we talked to someone from the corrections department last night, and he confirmed me for this today. They too don't have enough testing. They can't test all of their inmates, so they're having to screen and kind of just do their best to keep people apart, whether they can test them or not.
One of the solutions that we've heard of now from the state is trying to release a certain number of inmates. What kind of progress have we made on that?
Yes, and there really is a lot of intense pressure on this. There are other states that have actually done that already. The Columbia Law Agency has filed a lawsuit. They're taking the state to court, trying to get them to get everybody out, to really only have the inmates you absolutely have to keep locked up in that facility. So the secretary said today, of the corrections department said, we are considering, among all of the other steps that we're taking for the inmates that do need to stay, we are looking into how we can let some of these inmates out early, and it would specifically be for inmates that are low-level offenders, possibly, drug crimes or something like that, who are within 60 days of their release. The governor chimed in, said he's on board with that, and he's looking into it. They just want to be careful about, who it is they're going to let out. So he said we should probably hear more about that in the coming days.
It appears King County's homeless population is battling its own COVID-19 outbreak. 27 people living among 12 shelters have now tested positive for the virus, and the county's Human Services Department does not think they've reached their peak yet.
One of the shelters that's seeing an outbreak is a new space set up by the county of Boeing Field where 6 people have tested positive. It was designed to decrease crowding at another shelter in the Soto neighborhood.
Yeah, another cluster of cases that popped up is a shelter located on Beacon Hill in Seattle. That's where 12 people have now tested positive. Now, each of these shelters, the one at Boeing Field, the one in Beacon Hill, they are run by Catholic Community Services, and they say that they have moved the patients around to prevent further spread. Still, some of them remain at Boeing Field, where Community Services says they are quarantining in place. But Public Health says they've also set up so-called infection controls, but they did not really elaborate on what those infection controls are.
Some local governments with large homeless populations have moved people into hotels. That includes King County, which plans to move up to 400 people out of shelters starting this week. The county also has 3 sites for people who've tested positive or who are waiting for test results and don't have any place to isolate.
Now, meanwhile, it appears the county is fighting 2 outbreaks at once. The Seattle Times now reporting that Public Health has found more than 100 people who've been sickened by hepatitis A so far this year. Nearly 50 of those cases involve people experiencing homelessness.
And now nonprofit leaders are calling on the Seattle City Council to reopen public bathrooms. They say that the lack of access to running water and bathrooms make the disease more likely to spread among people who have to live outside. More ugly numbers from the Labor Department. The coronavirus outbreak has thrown millions of people out of work. The latest jobless claims show 1 in 10 Americans have now filed for unemployment during the pandemic. Here's CBS's Jill Schlesinger.
The Labor Department said more than 6.6 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits in the week ending April 4th. This means over the course of 3 weeks, nearly 16.8 million Americans filed claims for unemployment benefits. To put that in perspective, the U.S. economy added 20 million jobs in the 11-year recovery from 2009 to 2020.
And now, nearly 17 million of those jobs are gone.
Statewide, more than 170,000 people filed unemployment claims last week. That's down about 6% from the previous reports. But here's the thing. The state does not expect that trend to continue because the Employment Security Office has asked people to hold off on filing, if they can, until April 18th. That's the date when federal stimulus money should start to become available.
As you might imagine, the staff is overwhelmed with applications. Employment Security Department says it's working around the clock to make it easier to apply for these benefits, and also they're hiring new staff and hoping to upgrade the websites.
Yes, since mid-March, we just learned the state has paid out about $150 million in benefits. Now, once that federal assistance comes through, and you've mentioned this before, Dave, a lot of people will actually earn more than they would if they were still working because they're now going to get an extra $600 from the federal government. There is this really interesting graphic that I saw. It shows that if you're making $62,500 a year or less, you're actually going to see your weekly pay increase. That's how the numbers bear out.
I know some people thought that that was a bug or an oversight, but in fact, this came up during one of the earlier White House briefings, and the President and the Secretary of the Treasury said, no, it's not a bug, it's a feature. If the idea is to get more money into people's hands as soon as possible, they're not going to be fussy if that money happens to be slightly more than people were making before.
By the way, those personal payments from the federal government, we heard Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin say that those stimulus money from the coronavirus relief package should hit direct deposit accounts next week. Dave, do you think that's going to happen? I know we've seen a little bit of flaws in the system so far, though.
Well, I know they've worked hard to make it happen because that's the whole idea. But if you have a direct deposit account set up with the IRS, it should be there. And if not, you should be able to go online and set one up. Although, again, we've had anecdotal reports that the website can sometimes be so crowded that it operates pretty slowly. I know that's strange to find a website operating slowly.
Where have I heard that before?
but yeah, that can happen.
private construction projects are not considered essential under Governor Jay Inslee's stay-home order. Since that took effect, more than 50,000 construction workers have now filed for unemployment. At least one Republican state lawmaker now wants to change that. He is 14th District Representative Chris Corey, and he now joins me on the line. Thanks for the time.
Thank you for having me.
Representative, you sent a letter to the governor asking him to reopen private construction. Why do you think it's necessary?
So one of the things that we have seen since the governor has issued stay home, stay safe orders is that there's a variety of industries that were deemed as non-essential. However, they really are. When you look at both the short-term need and the long-term need, and construction is one of those. When you look at the order, he allowed public construction, so anybody doing public project work, to continue working, but he ordered private as non-essential. And so that to me was very upsetting because we have homes that need to be completed. We have a variety of construction projects that the private sector are doing that are essential to both the people of the state as well as the economy of the state. And what we've seen, and one of the things that I offered to him, was work safety plans that will allow construction to continue while protecting people's safety on the job. And really the only holdout now is making sure that the governor's office can allow that work to start sooner than the May 4th deadline that's currently imposed on construction.
Well, the governor, as you may know, he suggested there may be some wiggle room later on to lift private construction restrictions if we continue to flatten the curve. Here's what the governor said.
There may, and I emphasize may, be the ability to allow the industry to come back with certain more restrictions.
So what is your sense here, Representative? Do you think this could happen? Have you heard back from the governor on your request?
So I have not heard back, but I am hopeful based on other actions he has taken since his initial order to reevaluate the situation, look at the numbers, understand the impact that this has, and reopen it. I mean, we saw something similar last week with real estate agents. They were originally non-essential, and then they were moved to essential as long as they were practicing safe social distancing. So I'm hopeful that we can look at the big picture. We can protect the lives of people across Washington state, but we also need to protect our economy. And if we want to win this battle long term, it's going to take making sure we have an economy in place that can help cover the costs as we come through this. It's not, once this order is lifted, it doesn't mean everything goes back to normal. There are long-term budget implications, and construction is one of the biggest contributors to the Washington economy. So if we get that started sooner rather than later, it'll help us get through this storm quicker, and I think will save us some really big financial pain down the road.
But you do know the governor's, what he has said, his concern is that resuming widespread construction where workers are often close together, that could spread this disease. So can we properly do social distancing at a construction site?
I absolutely think we can. I think if you go to most construction sites, especially if you look at our smaller residential home construction, which is vital to addressing our housing needs in this state, you'll see that most of the time there's only several people on the job site at any given time. They usually are very well spaced out. I would argue that you would see better social distancing practiced at most of our construction sites than you would see going to the supermarket. So if we can give them a plan that allows them to get back to work while practicing social distance and having those health worker safety programs in place, it's really a win-win. And we need to make sure that we understand that when you lay these workers off, this is a direct cost to the state because those unemployment claims are going to come out of state dollars. They're not shutting down due to any fault of their own. It's a government shutdown. So the sooner we can get people running and avoid having them go onto unemployment or come off unemployment sooner, the better we all are going to be. So I do think you can manage both. You can have health and safety for the public and for workers while also getting your economy up and running.
And we do know, as you've mentioned, that public construction projects, things that are deemed essential to the public good, are still going on. Have you received any sort of answer as to why they have been determined to be okay to continue, but private construction has not?
So I was given some very generic responses in the beginning, somewhere around, wanting to make sure that we weren't interfering with local jurisdiction stuff or, interfering with government-funded housing projects. which again, I agree with. I think housing is important no matter who's building it, whether it's public or private. But there really wasn't an answer. And to me, it's if you say that Key Arena can continue, but my builder building a house for a family can't, there's something wrong there. And I would argue that if the public sector can do that job safely, the private sector can do it just as safely and should be allowed to work as well.
We will be back tomorrow and every day after with a 10-minute rundown of the daily local news. You can subscribe to this podcast, and you can also find our news coverage on mynorthwest.com or listen live at 97.3 FM.